Again, you find me rambling to you about what today? The memory of the cognitive elite, or, as I sometimes term them, the mental elite. Those with an intelligence 4 standard deviations above the norm in most ways that you can measure it, most ways that are normally distributed. Those who have minds that are in the top 100,000 on Earth, and those who effectively have an alien way of looking at the world. How does their memory work? First, if I just say random words in a foreign language, or random numbers, or binary bits, something which you don't have a lot of experience or training with storing, they will have an advantage here, biologically. It simply must be the case that upon testing the memories of a group of people, say 100 people or even 1,000 people, there must be variance among the performances of people. Variances that are not due to efficient encoding, but rather simply a biological advantage. They were just born with a better amygdala, with a better encoding system. And then there will be people who are disadvantaged. And then there will be some who are so disadvantaged that it borders on being a disability. So, they have a baseline advantage over you. Second, when they do remember something, commit something to memory rather, and when they do encode it, they have enormously efficient encoding mechanisms. And they will have cultivated these since their youth, practicing committing to memory what others would always delegate to paper. It's a bit similar to how some people practice playing an instrument without looking at the keys or prongs from the very start, to try to get a better feel for the instrument. They would have done so with their memory. And you can see some people who get sort of addicted to this and participate in quiz championships and so on. Or they get a bit of social capital and fame and esteem from just having a good memory, a really good memory, and so they get addicted to it. And that's really where they stay, because there are an infinite amount of low-level facts that you can commit to memory that can make you look astonishing if you recall them. Now, when it comes to their encoding mechanism, they will have random encoding techniques that just speed up the rate at which they can store things that take advantage of random associations, e.g. a word having a certain rhyme to it, or a number coinciding with the birthday of their wife or something like that. That's random. They will take advantage of that. Then they will take advantage of semantic encoding and trying to understand why something is true. so that it sticks better. But then, real crucially, they will try to encode it in such a way that they couldn't possibly recall it wrong, because at the same time, in parallel, they will be entertaining plausible nearby alternatives that are false, and they will figure out how to dismiss those so that they don't have false recall. That's just for encoding, by the way. Now, what about storage? Well, no matter how much we try to make a habit of it, especially during the exam days of school, we essentially just coast when it comes to our memory and the storage of memories. We just say, well, I'll just let my memory do the work. I don't have to rehearse anything. They don't think like that. They are aware that their memory is not infallible, and any memories that they do store will decay. And they have timers on them. Just like how a cat has little scent spots that it marks out in the backyard. Mentally, it has like little clocks attached to each of them that run out. And that's the case with their memory too. They will rehearse things involuntarily because their minds are ceaseless, constantly thinking. Now, what about proper recall? Recall at a time when it's actually required. How do they go about doing that? Well, for an ordinary person, like you and I, they will, we just simply probe our memory and say, hey, come on, help me out, bring back the memory, whatever it is. And they can do that as well. They can do that, and they will do that in part. But then they have a layer underneath. A layer underneath. While they're recalling, they're checking the plausibility. They're not just merely recalling, they're running it against other rules at the exact same time to make sure that it's actually not a false memory that they're recalling, something that just sounds plausible but it's actually wrong and doesn't make much sense. So they're checking it against all sorts of rules while that's happening. And also, at the same time, they're strengthening the memory itself. And you would think, well, isn't recalling going to strengthen the memory, like recalling in the moment? They see it as an opportunity to compound the memory even further and to test it even further and strengthen it even further. And while they're doing all of this, in parallel, they will have the massive amount of processes that are going on at the same time, because that memory that they're recalling will be embedded within the discourse of their speech. And so they will want to articulate that memory and present it in a beautiful way, a way that's memorable and entertaining and fitting for the situation. And for the audience. So, just a brief reminder here that I'm not saying these people are infallible. I'm not saying they are superhuman, although they will seem like it. But this is sort of some insight into how their mind works. And once again, for the sake of empathy and to understand what it must be like for them, What is it like when you're around someone who is in their late 60s, early 70s, and although they may have been lucky and hardworking, they have evidently been embedded within highly enabling social systems, which over the past few decades have not punished them for not learning, and so they just simply haven't learned things. For a large amount of time, they can simply coast upon the learning faculties that they developed in their formative years during compulsory schooling, and then the learning that they did in their early 20s or 30s when they were establishing themselves. But if they haven't kept up with that, if they haven't done reading and learned new skills and made new long-term relationships, and if they haven't had people around them who've challenged them, and especially if the surrounding socio-cultural and economic systems have been highly enabling and not required them to learn, and they just haven't had the appetite for it, or they have a low appetite to begin with for it, they will start to become old, mentally, very old, very rapidly, and it will be evident to anybody who knows what I'm talking about, what this is like, how you have to repeat things over and over and over again, how you have to adjust your register, and how you just understand that certain facts will just not be available to them, certain abstractions they won't be able to follow to their very end because they just don't have the patience, they can't keep up with it. It's exactly like that to the cognitive elite. That's how we look to them. And you may object and say, oh, come on. You don't have to tell me something twice. I don't have to have things repeated and lessons repeated. Well, of course, yes, you do. Right? But you say, oh, but not that much. No, really, that much. That's what it's like. Except, for us, the things that are repeated in a different way. Each time. With a different register. Or through a different narrative. Through many different ways, such that it can, finally, eventually stick in our minds. What would you do if you had a class of people with neurodegenerative disorders and they are human beings? They deserve to be looked after. What would you do with such a group of people? If they couldn't look after themselves, they just couldn't function in the real world, and they would get lost on the way to the bus stop, and things like this. Well, you would create a sort of ward for them, a home for them, and you would have carers who are well educated in the matter, who would try to give them as much dignity and quality of life as possible, but understanding deep down that it's never going to be possible for these people, unfortunately. It's never going to be possible for them to have so many things and to do so many things, but it just is what it is. You wouldn't consistently and constantly remind them of their state, the state that they're in, because there's just no need to. That is in fact actually abusive to do that. And it's certainly not productive or constructive. They would be aware of what your role is in things, of course. But now, let's suppose, alternatively, that you have a group or a class of people who are similarly disadvantaged, but they cannot be told this because they cannot metabolize that truth. It just cannot sit with them very well. They will always feel the need to escape, even though it's not to their benefit and they're not able to survive. That's what we're like. Now, in some sort of obvious and trivial way, we know that. Can you really be planted in the middle of a jungle or a desert island and make it for a few years? Probably not, if you haven't cultivated those bushcraft skills, and even then it would be tremendously challenging. And that's just the survivalistic side of things. Beg your pardon, that's just the survivalistic side of things. Never mind the socializing side of things. You would go mad not having any company, right? Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the enormously complicated systems that are all around us, that we take for granted, and we just skate along the surface every single day. When we use our smartphones, when we go to the supermarket, completely ignorant of the massive import and export system and manufacturing systems all underneath all of that. And you can say to me, well, yes, I'm aware of that in a theoretical sense, but that's what we have jobs for and the division of labour for. You know, it's just ordinary people like me who just took a different route in life, and they're the ones maintaining that route, that system. I have my place in a certain system as well, whether that's in education or communication or in the tourist industry, whatever it is, right? But how does all of it stick together? How does all of it work? And what about the incredibly deep ideas that make something like a smartphone possible? Something that can store billions, perhaps verging on trillions now. I think so. I think I've seen a terabyte SD card. Trillions of bits of information. I mean, it just sounds like magic to people centuries prior, but we take it for granted. But who came up with that? Who came up with that? Who's running these dynamic systems all around us? You ever look outside and you say, who actually owns that building, right? Now, that's going more towards the capitalistic side of things. And indeed, there are people who are like you and I, who are extremely wealthy, right? But I'm not talking about that. I didn't mean to anyway. What I really mean to talk about are the people who understand the concepts that you and I will never reach meaningfully in any way whatsoever, even if we spend decades, even if we spend decades of our lives devoted to trying to understand it. In the same way that you know that the elderly person that I was painting a picture of before, the person in their late 60s, early 70s who has coasted and not learned for many decades and so on, you can't expect them to do a PhD in mathematical physics and then come out on top. And by the way, someone who's doing a PhD in mathematical physics, although they will be an incredibly bright person, they might only be a few standard deviations above the mean in intelligence, and just have a bit more perseverance, a bit more memory, willpower, etc. I'm talking about people who are 4 standard deviations above the mean. People who have that innate nature to them, biologically, and have cultivated it from a very young age, and had the metacognition to know who they are, and then have carefully, chameleonically slotted themselves in these positions. They are geniuses. That, by definition, they are geniuses. They will recognize each other. They will send signals that we just cannot even understand. It could be as subtle as like that, or like that. They will tell jokes that we won't understand. Jokes like conducting hosting an entire research program. Something like that. That would be like their version of like a conversation. They would reply to one another in movements, and you would think this is just nuts. This can't be true. How could somebody have that level of patience and oversight and so on? That's what I'm talking about. I said it yesterday. 30 billion chickens on Earth. Not a single one of them will ever understand the concept of Wednesday. And thus, they will never understand the concept of a calendar, let alone be able to use one. It just happens to them without any awareness on their part. And the thing is, for someone like me, okay, I do have a higher level of metacognition than the average person. I just think that's true. I do think about thinking more than the average person, and perhaps that's because I have the opportunity to. But also, I think I've got a higher curiosity than the average person. I just think that's true, given the range of things that I've explored. No, I'm not puffing myself up here, but when you think of like the level of curiosity, the baseline level of curiosity of an average person, how they watch the same shows over and over again, how they are so predictable that we have algorithms that can just suggest shopping to them and get them stuck in a cycle. It's like, it's like the chickens on the farm who they have their needs met, and so they don't care. They don't care. Wednesday, who cares? It doesn't have any relevance to my life. And then us ordinary people will be like, oh, okay, a tensor space, who cares? Arithmetic and geometry, who cares? Right? Actually, that stuff is very, very, very important. How do we get the level of energy that we have? How do we get the level of food that we have? What are the force multipliers actually deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in there? Can you build a car? The engine of a car? No, you can't. You just wouldn't believe it. What I mean when I say about force multipliers, how there will be a component in there no bigger than this that will be responsible for so much. And we know this because of our smartphones, how much goes into teeny tiny components, how much thought goes into algorithms that multiply the efficiency of something by a factor of 1,000, that catch errors, that just enable all of this dizzying complexity all around us to be possible. And the biggest thing is what holds it all together. It's them. They understand. They understand. We are given pieces. We are given roles. They do this indirectly. They understand who should be where and who should be learning what at what given time and what can keep things stable. You know, even though just a cursory look at the news cycle, if you get addicted to such a thing, can make you feel as if the world's falling apart. But as a whole, it just isn't. It's actually functioning and there's not mass unrest. Anyhow, if I get too much into that, people will start becoming very they will start objecting quite a bit. This is how their memory works, and that's just another rambling collaboration for the day.